Welcome back to Viewpoints, listeners. I'm your host, Henry Grossek. We're in the middle of discussion on the time we're finding in this pandemic from an educational point of view with Dr. David Roy, lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales. Welcome back, David.
Hello.
David, before the break, the last thing we were talking about was the need for equity of opportunity for all students, and it was through the prism initially with of those children with disabilities. Moving forward, what's the biggest lesson that, let's say on the macro scale, governments, because at the end of the day they're very important, can learn from this to ensure that all students get that better education?
I think one of the key things that we're realizing is just how essential the teaching profession is and how essential education and schools are to the wider community. They've been undervalued over decades, and recognizing that when schools are not there to support the kids, then the system slowly breaks down. I am still, and I've said this time and time again in different contexts, I am amazed by the work that teachers have done across the board, and principals as well, to catch up with the changing circumstances of suddenly schools closing and kids having to be online or partially online and partially in the school, and ensure that those online kids are getting a depth of education resources and support, while at the same time supporting kids who are still going to schools, because schools haven't closed. They've remained open for other essential workers. So that kind of double job all the time, and just responding to it, and despite some of the rhetoric coming from media and certain politicians that schools are now holding the community to hostage because they're not fully reopening, and recognising that actually teachers and schools have been doing an amazing job. That's the key thing for me, that we need to recognise that, but also the fact that distance education is a viable alternative. It is not a make-do. There can be depth, real depth that comes from that learning experience. And just as we've been looking at working from home for businesses and working online as courses in higher education, as we were talking earlier, actually schools can also embrace that online learning as well. And there should maybe be a greater opportunity offered to families who wish to do that. That would free up schools, and the whole idea of the distance education that used to go on and still does for many rural communities in Western Australian farms and in Victoria and in New South Wales, that could maybe be offered more within urban context, and to allow those kids that want to work from home and have family capacity to allow them to work from home to actually do so. And it also maybe brings in questions about suspensions, that there's potential to make sure that kids who are suspended, if they have to be, and we know suspension rates have been going up, and that ties to disability because they are very highly represented within those figures, which is still being looked at and studied as to is there a form of bias going on there, that there can be work offered to those kids to ensure that when they're suspended, they're still getting access to an education.
An interesting point on the whole concept of remote learning, as we call it now. A good friend of mine who was a mentor when I was a much younger teacher and principal, he was principal for many years of what was called correspondence school, later became distance education school. And they were providing remote learning to many children across the state every day of the school year. And while it wasn't perhaps ideal, those people, claimed that it was a very successful venture. And so the concept of remote learning or distance education isn't actually as new as some people think.
Correct.
There's a lesson to learn from that, isn't there?
Oh, there's a massive learning, and also from the homeschooling community. And we have to remember what's been happening has not been homeschooling. Homeschooling is when the family dictates the curriculum and is doing direct teaching. And a lot of what's been happening has still been the teachers directing the curriculum and the learning, and the parents being facilitators. And what will be interesting to see is, will homeschooling increase because of this as parents embrace that aspect for those who have found success with it? Already homeschooling is at a much higher enrollment rate than just normal mainstream schooling. Of course, the numbers are still low, but the amount, the increase per year of around 12 to 15% is high in comparison to, say, the 2% growth in mainstream enrolment. So will that continue? Will that then require government to actually look about potentially supporting that rather than just overseeing and giving no financial support to it? So that's one area, and again, things such as the success of distance education and School of the Air and different states' provision of that, the lessons learned from the experts there have really helped within this situation, and I do think it's going to grow, and I don't think that's a bad thing. The more opportunities that we give for alternative schooling for those kids to succeed better, it's what education's about. It's just finding the best way to let kids succeed. And so long as we support the systems, as long as we support the teachers who are engaging and in charge of those areas, then that can only benefit us as a community. The statistics tell us that people who homeschool and people who distance education have no better or worse outcomes than kids who go to a mainstream school. The same percentages go to university, are employed, go straight into work, do apprentices. There is no statistical differences.
No, we've got to change our mindset. Another area that's of great importance, I think, to all of us is how we evaluate school success, Dave. And for a long time now, we've been very focused on the value adding that we do in the basic subjects of English and maths vis-a-vis NAPLAN. And I know there's a NAPLAN review going on. But under these circumstances, there's a lot of other skills they're called soft skills, such as resilience, flexibility, creativity, that parents, teachers and children have had to draw on, and assessment this year is going to be quite different to what we've done in previous years. Is there scope there to re-look at school success and student achievement through a different prism in the future?
It's a challenging one. The ideas of creativity and mindfulness and resilience, there are still discussions and arguments about can you actually teach those soft skills directly, or are they more skills that are developed in the context of individual subject knowledge areas? And the jury is out on that. So in some ways we've been focusing on these 21st century skills, not really even knowing within normal schooling situations how to fully assess it and whether or not it is part of the wider teacher expertise just to recognise those areas of emotional and psychological growth in children happening. I think what we're going to have to do is move away from some form of formal summative assessment of it and return back to teacher expertise in being able to make judgments. And sometimes we want to tick boxes and formalise it, and we forget that actually all teachers in the classroom and online can actually pick up these subtle clues about how children are growing through their identity and psychology, and just start to trust teacher judgment rather than trying to find some form of formal testing that probably has very little validity in actually demonstrating results because it's a tick box as opposed to a whole person growth. Teachers embed these skills throughout all their teaching practices within children to help to develop their interactions with each other, their empathy, the resilience, their creativity, and kids grow within the context of the learning when they do that. So I think we should actually trust teachers in doing that rather than imposing more summative tests upon schools and kids.
It's an interesting point you make, because we've got preliminary feedback from the department on how we will be evaluated ourselves and how we'll be assessing children. And there's a degree of higher degree of observational, anecdotal and evidence. And also you mentioned the word trust is going to have to come into how we evaluate much more this year rather than formal summative tests. Good point you make. David, as always, it's been a great pleasure having you on the program. How has COVID-19 impacted on the Roy family? You're still all together, I presume.
We are all together. We're one of the old households, probably because we have cultural capital, that has been thriving. We actually like being at home. We have 4 different learning systems going on in our house. I am doing research, and my lovely wife partner is actually undertaking some further studies in higher education. One of our children is actually homeschooled already, so he's just enjoying us being around as we do even more homeschooling. And the eldest is enjoying the online, partly because all his friends are online as well. And I'm sure that if they went back to school, he'd want to be back in that face-to-face. So we've been very fortunate with very supportive teachers, very supportive schools, very supportive systems. So we're not at that stage yet where we wish to self-isolate from each other in the house, but we're thoroughly enjoying the experience. The only thing we don't enjoy is when we have to do grocery shopping, because other people don't seem to understand the idea of social distancing to the same degree.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for another very informative and uplifting interview, David, and we look forward to catching up with you again in the near future.
A pleasure as always, Henry, and just keep yourself safe, everyone, and wash your hands.
For sure. That was Dr. David Roy, lecturer in School of Education at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales, and a great advocate for education per se. We'll take a short break, listeners.